This is the Farming for a Better Climate podcast. I'm Séamus Murphy. In this episode, I speak to Professor Davy McCracken of SRUC's Hill and Mountain Research Centre, based at Kirkton Auchtertyre Research Farm near Creanlarich. Davy is involved in a range of research and demonstration projects investigating the economic, social and environmental resilience of upland livestock systems. This podcast was recorded in early March prior to the lockdown, and the topics covered mainly focus on climate change in agriculture and rewilding. We hope you enjoy the podcast and make sure a like and share on whatever platform you're listening. Welcome, Davy.
Hi, Séamus. Nice to be here.
We're just going to discuss what has been happening in agriculture since the beginning of 2020. Everything seems to be dominated by the coronavirus at the moment, but one of the other massive issues of 2020 is the climate emergency. Farmers are concerned about the climate emergency. How have you seen that develop since January?
Well, since January, National Farmers Union for Scotland had their annual conference, an AGM, in January, and at that meeting, I wasn't there myself, unfortunately, but at that meeting, Fergus Ewing, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Economy, Connectivity and Tourism, made a major announcement of additional funding to be made available to Scottish farmers to help them address the climate emergency. I think it's true to say that although we've had the declaration of the climate emergency in Scotland and elsewhere last year, many farmers might be actually wondering what can they actually do to actually help with that. And really, the type of measures that the Cabinet Secretary announced and the funding for that announced in January were along the lines of better or additional funding for encouraging greater use of soil sampling, soil testing, and the management that then goes on top of that to make sure that the soils are actually healthy enough and are actually able to mobilise any fertiliser that's put on them. And more importantly, if the NPK status is such that they don't need fertiliser, a particular range of fertiliser, reduce the amount of fertilisers going on to fields unnecessarily. But the other biggies that was announced in January was funding for woodland creation, because that can help with what they call the sequestering of the storing of carbon. And agroforestry in particular was actually mentioned within that woodland creation package, and also a major announcement of funding over the next 10 years for peatland restoration, which again is another major way that farmers can actually help lock up and store carbon in their soils or in new trees and woodlands on their farm going forward.
Yeah, and this is all guidelines for policy post 2024.
Yes, I mean at the minute, I think you're aware, Cabinet Secretary and Scottish Government have indicated that they want things to remain sort of stable through until 2024. But nevertheless, there's still a lot of discussion ongoing at the minute about what type of policy landscape is needed in Scotland post 2024, and also a lot of discussion about what type of let's call them pilots for the sake of argument, what type of pilot schemes might be trialled between now and 2024 to work out what may be best to sort of roll out over the country as a whole. So there's a whole raft of discussions going on at the minute. Last June at the Royal Highland Show, again the Cabinet Secretary Fergus Ewing announced a formation of a Farming and Food Production Future Policy Group, which are currently in the midst of their deliberations. I don't sit directly on that group. I sit on an advisory panel for the Scottish Government that's very closely aligned with that group at the moment. And we've had a number of meetings since January as well, one of which was just actually a 2-day meeting in Stirling last week, where as well as hearing and discussing what type of models are being suggested for support in Scotland going forward, we also heard from a range of presentations and had quite a bit of discussion about what others are doing out with Scotland and what direction of travel they're actually taking. Now, whether it's the EU, whether it's England or even Wales, it's clear that a major change over the last 6 months has been the fact that climate emergency and the associated what we call the biodiversity crisis has really come to the fore and is being prioritised in thinking about support going forward. That doesn't mean to say that things like food security are being ignored completely. It just means that the type of goals, aspirations, rationale for supporting agriculture going forward, the rationale for that is meaning that the actions and rewarding actions to address climate and biodiversity issues is in the top tier. There's other aspirations, social, in a country like Scotland with such remote areas dependent on agriculture and other land uses. The social and cultural function is just as important, or is important, but they're coming into like a second tier now rather than in the first tier, and that's only to be expected. If you are designing policy, you need to have 2 or 3 key things you want to try and achieve, and then design the policy framework around that, and then you can sense check how doing that with those 2 or 3 things in mind, how that helps or doesn't help some of your second tier, your other additional aspirations. But putting everything in the same level of priority at once makes it virtually impossible to satisfy everything, and it just becomes a bit of a mess. So governments across Europe and across the UK are having to think what is going to be the key headlines that they're trying to design the policy to, and climate change and biodiversity are increasingly way up there.
And it does look like there will be quite a difference between what this policy in Scotland looks like as opposed to the rest of the UK. Is that down to Scotland putting climate change and the climate emergency that bit higher on the agenda?
It's actually down to so the major change that's happening elsewhere in the UK, in England primarily, but also increasingly in Wales, is a move away from direct support going to farmers simply for being farmers. In England, they have said that they will be phasing out what would be called the first pillar payments, the direct payments. Phasing those out by 2027 is I think what the current model actually suggests, with a view that by 2027 the primary support going to farmers from the public purse will be solely for delivering what's called public goods, these wider benefits. In Scotland, keeping things stable and simple through until 2024 has been a reflection of the importance that Scottish Government put on farming as part of the wider rural economy, and not wanting to disrupt things too much within that. And part of the current thinking is how much support going forward could or needs to be still that sort of form of what we would think of as a basic support payment, as opposed to a move solely to paying rewarding farmers for public good delivery. In 10 years' time, while the basic policy frameworks may be different between the likes of Scotland and England, I would not be surprised if actually what both governments want to actually achieve, particularly with regard to climate emergency and biodiversity crisis, will be fully very similar and very front and centre. They're just looking at different mechanisms at how you actually would actually achieve them. And in England, even though it's 2027, they want to start relatively quickly with their environmental land management programme, what's called the ELMS programme, to move fully to paying for public goods. It's quite ambitious to actually do. You need to get a whole host of metrics right if you want to be able to, or want to be sure that you can actually measure a baseline to begin with, where any one farm or business is starting, as well as how quickly that business is then being able to move over subsequent years to actually delivering those things. That's even for a scientist like myself to say, an ecologist like myself, that is quite a big ask. Because lots of the type of metrics that you would consider or need to help understand whether something's been delivered or not are not information, the type of information that's currently being collected from farms as a matter of course. Most of the information collection on farms is to do with regulating the current funding framework. Have you not done something? Have you done something, etc.? Not focused on the detail of what are you actually producing in terms of outputs, other than numbers of animals and or crops grown, etc.
It's really important that the research is done in that so that it can be an accurate representation of the work that's being done.
Yes.
And the benefit that is having.
Yep. And part of the challenge is when you get to the level of a farm, what is a 250 hectare farm, or in our case at Kirkton Auchtertyre, a 2,200 hectare farm, what is that producing, or what is part of that farm producing? Then it is feasible to actually make estimates of how much something might be provided. But I always think of it in terms of we have done quite a lot of peatland restoration on the farms. But you could go into any peatland, say a 100 hectare sort of peatland that's been restored. Yeah. But just because of the variation in the sort of depth of the soil, etc., there will be differences in how much carbon has been sequestered or water has been held back across that peatland. So you can get an average for what that peatland is doing, but you'll have quite a lot of variation in around that average. And that's, for me, that's fine. Yeah. But for someone, whether it's a national government or an agency of government or a private industry that's investing in carbon sequestration as a carbon credit or whatever, the jury's still out whether that having quite a big level of variation around the number you're using to say this is what has been produced from this farm, that can potentially cause issues for some people. Yeah. And it's getting an acceptance as to, can we actually get that level of variation reduced? Well, possibly, but I strongly believe there's still going to be quite a big figure around it. It's an average of this, but it could be stretched from there to there. The main focus has to be on establishing whether government and other funding agencies are comfortable with that degree of uncertainty, because that's what it is, uncertainty around what exactly has been produced. For me, the key is not to be comparing what you are doing on your farm and I'm doing on my farm and somebody else is doing somewhere else. You know, one way you can deal with that variation is to actually assess how things are changing on the one farm over time. Yeah. The variation is likely to stay the same, but if it's following a direction of travel that you want, if you're increasing something or maintaining something or reducing something, you know, like diffuse pollution or whatever it may be, as long as the direction of travel is going in the desired way, I personally think having a level of variation around that is still acceptable. But that does then mean the need to have metrics, information being collected on those outputs at a farm level, at least on a 2 or a 3 year basis, if not more, so as you can start to have some level of comfort that what I am asking of as a funding agency that particular farmer to do, she or he is actually starting to do it right from the start.
More work, I'm sure, will be done on that in the coming months and years ahead anyway, and hopefully it'll deliver an outcome that is a benefit to the farmer, the government and wider society as a whole. That's the ultimate goal.
Yes, and I know you weren't deliberately putting in any order to that, but I would turn that on its head. Government policy, rather than putting farmers at the forefront of the goal, farmers are now becoming the deliverers of the primary goal is climate change. Yeah. So we have got a large ask in Scotland of net zero by 2045. If agriculture industry across Scotland is to be on track to meet that target by 2045, then by 2032, agriculture sector in Scotland has to reduce their current level of CO2 equivalent emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, by something in the order of 60 to 70%. That's a big ask.
And another issue that's a little bit connected to that, but has been in the news a bit more recently, is rewilding in relation to Scotland. So you spoke a bit about peatland restoration area when you spoke about the climate emergency, but that would also be considered a form of rewilding.
Yes, indeed. So, rewilding, like biodiversity covers a wide range of things. Rewilding is also one of those phrases that what you think of rewilding and I think of rewilding could be completely different. It's one of these phrases that can cover a wide range of things. And for me, rewilding goes all the way from planting some trees along a riverbank on a farm, to creating a shelter belt, to creating a wetland, all the way through to what many people think of as rewilding, which is remove livestock and browsers like deer from large areas of land and allow that landscape to change, to rewild, either by natural regeneration of the shrubs and the trees that historically would have been there, or a large proportion of rewilding, as is currently practiced, at least in the UK, will have to involve a significant amount of active management by humans to go in and physically plant things to get them to establish. And that's a huge range of things. And generally in the media, when rewilding has been talked about, it's that one extreme, the huge landscape change, get rid of people, get rid of the livestock, put in trees, maybe reintroduce some lynx, talk of reintroducing wolves, bears, etc., etc. That's what really creates a lot of sort of fear and conflict. But actually, rewilding is a large. It covers a wide range of different approaches. While we can consider large scale natural woodland creation and management in the future in a few parts of Scotland. Standing here at the minute, looking out on Scotland's landscape, the biggest single thing that Scottish farmers and land managers could actually do that would fall into the category of rewilding in my head is to engage in peatland restoration. We have 2 million hectares of peatland in Scotland. 60% of that 2 million hectares is degraded in some sort of shape or form. It's emitting gases to the atmosphere. Most of that peatland's in the uplands, but not all of it. There's lots of remnant, but still large areas of lowland peatland in the central belt of Scotland. All of it is valuable, and where restoring it is not going to release more carbon than actually the restoration would do. At Kirkton Auchtertyre, we've about 100 hectares that it's highly unlikely we'd ever seek to restore, because it's so far removed from the main part of the farm that the damage we would do trying to get machinery into that part of the farm would vastly outweigh any benefits that the restoration would actually achieve. Nevertheless, there's a big proportion of that 2 million hectares of damaged peatland, or 2 million hectares of peatland in total. There's about 600,000 hectares minimum are restorable. It would be cost effective to restore, and there is a big focus and government support on providing the capital funding to allow land managers and farmers to get the contractors in to actually do that. And the fact that we've now got a 10-year commitment from Scottish Government to significant funding for peatland restoration, I hope will allow us to move to what I would call, what in my head is a multi-annual programme. To date, peatland restoration funding has only been confirmed each spring. And so the funding becomes available in spring 2019. It has to be paid and used up by March 2020, and then a line's drawn in the sand and the cycle starts again. Which means that most applications for peatland restoration as it stands at the minute are granted in the autumn, and the restoration work has to happen in the winter, and most of that restoration work is happening in upland areas during the winter. It's not a great time to do that. Now, there is reasons why you wouldn't want an awful lot of peatland restoration happening on peatlands during the sort of the main bird breeding season in the spring and the early part of the summer, but nevertheless, there is a rationale for actually being able to allow any one business who's seeking to restore peatland to be able to do that over an 18-month period rather than just narrow it down to a period of 1 year. And certainly those businesses, contractors who are dealing and helping with the peatland restoration, it's in their interest for them to have some security that there is funding and therefore a need for them to invest in the type of new machinery, etc., that they might need to allow them to do the scale of peatland restoration that we need to achieve in Scotland going forward.
You have done some peatland restoration at Kirkton.
Yes, yeah. So under the Peatland Action Programme, over 2 winters, 3 and 4 years ago, I think it is now. We engaged in a variety of different peatland restoration techniques. Primary technique we were doing, it's called reprofiling peat hags. Peat hags are these vertical faces of open peat, and basically the contractor were taking the turf off the top, smoothing that vertical face down so it was a shallow slope, putting the turf back and basically capping the bare peat, with a view that will then increase the likelihood that the peatland will actually re-wet. And we've put in a number of dams across some of the erosion channels that can occur as water is running off of the hills. So I think we did 16 kilometres of peat hag restoration over both of those winters, sort of thing.
And do you think it's been successful so far?
It's been successful in terms of because most of it was peat hag restoration. Then certainly those peat hags have remained capped. In some other areas of Scotland, in one of those winters, there was an issue that the reprofiling took place, but then very heavy frosts actually caused frost heave. And if you can imagine a rectangular piece of turf all laid beside each other, that was actually lifting them out of the soil a bit and preventing that sort of seal. But at Kirkton, everything is fine there. What we're going to be doing over the next couple of years is putting some soil moisture probes into areas of peat that we have restored, and areas that we know it's not going to be feasible to restore in the future, and compare and contrast the soil profile over them. We've restored peatland at Kirkton. We haven't restored a functioning wetland peatland system at Kirkton and Auchtertyre yet. It will take some years before that will be achievable. What I would hope we've done at Kirkton and Auchtertyre is now given those restored areas of peatland more capacity to hold water to a greater depth for longer during the summer. I'm not saying in the middle of the summer they're going to be holding as much water as a proper established peatland would, but we want to get some quantification of that and see how higher up in the restored peatlands the water table is now coming versus the unrestored areas, to allow some basic quantification and management of expectations going forward. If you restore 100 hectares of this type of peatland today, is it going to be 5 years' time, 10 years' time before the real benefits are actually achieved?
And then you'd expect that to have biodiversity benefits, carbon capture, and then natural flood management also sort of.
All of the above. And again, the carbon capture in particular will take some time. So basically what we've done is reduce the amount of, what we've done in the restored areas at the moment is markedly reduce the amount of carbon that is being lost. It's still likely, until that peatland, those restored areas wet up completely, it's still likely that they're still going to be emitting carbon. But it was great, even when the contractors were there actively managing the peatlands. In between the 2 years that the 2 winters we were doing that, we had a workshop, and the day, I think it was late September or mid-September, the day we took students and others interested up onto the peatlands, the amount of dragonflies and damselflies that were flying around the little bits of water in the erosion channels we'd created by dams, there was an immediate benefit to them. Even though we get 2.5 to 3 metres of rain a year at Kirkton Auchtertyre, there's very few areas of the farm where there's standing water. And that type of biodiversity needs some level of standing water for them to lay their eggs in, etc., etc.
So it's been a successful rewilding attempt anyway in that case. So maybe when we speak about rewilding, we should talk more about those kind of measures rather than the kind of the links.
I would strongly urge any discussion about rewilding, one, to actually accept and come from the premise that rewilding covers a wide range of things. And if there is going to be a detailed discussion of it, then that discussion needs to narrow down right from the start. Today we're going to be talking about rewilding in terms of wetland creation, or woodland creation and management, or peatland restoration, or large scale landscape scale change that ultimately would want to actually have links released into it. It has to be, it's essential. You're not going to get a proper informed discussion, debate going forward unless it's clear what's the envelope around which you're actually talking about today.
The last point that I wanted to ask you about was just ultimately the overarching negative press that farming, particularly livestock farming, seems to be getting in the last few months. What are your thoughts on that?
So, you see in the farming press, you see in social media, and you see in a range of TV programmes that have been on over the last few months, that the sort of red meat industry, globally as much as in the UK, is getting an extremely bad press, as you say, and farmers in the UK are quite rightly getting very concerned about that, partly because, or largely because, most of the negative aspects of red meat production that are on show, on display in those sort of programmes are focused primarily on the more intensively managed, the feedlot type situations that actually occur in the United States and other parts of the world, where although those production systems are allowing a volume of meat to be produced over a relatively short period of time, which reduces the amount of greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of meat emitted, which is one of the major metrics that are used for livestock systems across the globe in a climate change perspective. Nevertheless, many of those, if not all of those systems, are actually utilising food for those livestock feedlot systems that's been produced elsewhere in the world, and in some cases produced elsewhere in the world with damage to the environment and biodiversity on that. So we're not comparing like for like, certainly, and there are very, very few, if any, really intensified feedlot systems in the UK or the Republic of Ireland that are focused on that level of input. We do feed cereals to some livestock to actually finish them for a relatively short period of time in the winter, in some cases, rather than everything being completely grass fed. But those type of programs completely miss the point that the majority of livestock based sheep and cattle systems in the UK are getting the vast majority of their inputs, energy inputs, from grass and other type of forages that we cannot as humans consume. And their grazing means that they're transferring that otherwise inedible material into some form of protein, be it meat or milk, that we as humans can then sort of consume. So I can understand the rationale and the concerns for farmers why that they feel that they are being put upon in the red meat industry. Having said that, and parking that to one side as a major reason why things are as they are, nevertheless, there is still a need for livestock farming in the UK and in Scotland to actually change practices to varying degrees, to actually help address the scale and the time frame that we actually have to address the climate emergency that we're currently in. So it's not business. It's not business as usual for livestock farmers. Even if we can get the general public to recognise and accept that the vast majority of livestock farming in the UK is not based on a potentially damaging feedlot system. Even if we can get that recognition and acceptance of that, nevertheless, there is still changes that have to be made in those systems.
Yeah, that'll come back to some of the stuff that we talked about previously as well with the rewilding and bringing in incorporating these measures into your standard beef and sheep system.
Very much so, because the focus is on, we're trying to reach net zero in the future. Nobody's talking, and I don't think anybody will be talking in Scotland about every farm having to get to carbon neutral, as in no carbon emissions. That's physically impossible. The net is important, so it's accepted that livestock will continue to emit greenhouse gas emissions in some form. It's a case of how can you reduce the amount of greenhouse gases emitted, either by reducing stock numbers and increasing the cost effectiveness of production with a smaller number of stock, or feed additives to actually reduce the amount of methane, for example, that's excreted into the atmosphere, etc. Nevertheless, a big part of how we're going to achieve net zero in agriculture going forward in Scotland is for farming and farmers and land managers to be engaging in a lot more locking up of carbon in their soils through peatland restoration or wetland creation or in new trees and woodlands that are planted in those farms.
Mm-hmm. We'll have to come to terms with the fact that there needs to be an acceptable level of emissions for meat that we eat.
Yes, no, indeed. And we also have to have a greater recognition as to what are the benefits from meat eating or a lightly reduced amount of meat eating, but nevertheless a focus on good quality meat and what benefits that can actually bring. I mean, if we were in sub-Saharan Africa, we wouldn't be talking about getting rid of livestock altogether, because the meat and the milk that those animals can produce are essential for human nutrition and growth in those sort of situations. There is as much a responsibility from the consumer side of things to change their consumption patterns, particularly in the developed part of the globe, to actually assist in meeting our overall sort of objectives for addressing a very scary climate situation going forward over the next 10, 20, 30 years.
That's great. Thanks very much, David. Please visit the Farming for a Better Climate website, where you'll find more information on practical work that has been done by other focus farmers and our current soil regenerative agricultural group, and more information about climate change and agriculture and how you can mitigate and adapt your farming business. And please follow us on Facebook and Twitter for more information and updates from Farming for a Better Climate.